Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. ISIS is one of the most bloodthirsty jihadi groups in history. Syrian analyst and author Hassan Hassan has written a book about where they came from and how they operate. Surely that doesn't mean that they're undefeatable.
No, they are unstoppable. They will remain with us as a menace for at least a decade. They're not going to go away because their opponents are not capable of doing the right thing to defeat them.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. As we've seen in the tragic killings in Orlando and San Bernardino, the Islamic State's ability to plan and inspire attacks on Americans run beyond the borders of their so-called Caliphate. Hassan Hassan is a Syrian analyst and co-author of the book ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. We'll talk about their history, how they operate, and why, despite their barbarism, so many people are devoted to their cause. Hassan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Your hometown is a Syrian town called Abu Mosab. It's on the border with Iraq. What's happening there now?
Nothing much is happening. Last week there was an attempt to retake the city from ISIS with the help of a local group supported by the Pentagon, but the attempt failed, although they actually went deep into the city.
So it's still under ISIS control?
It's still there, yeah.
Do you know what life is like for people living there?
Well, I mean, the story is well familiar. When ISIS stormed into the town after the takeover of Mosul, and the massive weaponry they got from the Iraqi army, they started a campaign of subduing kind of the population. It was a campaign that took a while, and I think the first thing they did was to establish a square. They called it like the Justice Square, or the kind of Sharia square. This is where they behead people, or they hang their heads, severed heads on pipes, and that's where they flag people, lash people, and so on and so forth. That's
so
like
this is just to terrorize the population.
It is, yeah. Especially in the city center, the urban center. That's where they have like the main site for punishments and for deterring people, for making people think twice before they rebel against the organization.
What is a typical ISIS fighter like? Describe him for me.
Typically, it's hard to say because they're different kinds. In the book, we identify 6 categories of people who join ISIS, but I think the most important ones are 3 categories. There's the long-standing radicals, people who are really believe in this ideology. Not today, not yesterday. It was they believed in this for a decade or two, and it's part of a movement, an extremist movement that labels fellow Muslims as kind of infidels or apostates. And there's the young people. These are very young people who joined ISIS when it stormed their villages, or before that there was a process of indoctrination and kind of recruitment throughout Syria and Iraq. These are young people who suddenly started to think, oh, this is maybe an Islamic State, and this is what they tell us about Islam. We never heard these stories before, and this is what we believe is the right group to join. These tend to be very zealous. They believe in the organization. Suddenly they act as adults. They speak back against their parents. They say, no, you're wrong. This is the organization that will ensure that we dominate, and so on and so forth. And there's another category. I think this is very important, because it's beyond ISIS. It goes beyond this challenge of ISIS, which is people who believe in the political ideology of ISIS. People who think that ISIS stands for something, and not only stands for something, but also capable of doing something, which is to break the stagnation of the political order in the region, or the kind of...
So you're saying political ideology, not necessarily the theological Islamic ideology?
Absolutely, yeah. Notice that there are only 2 categories who believe in the sort of religious ideology that ISIS believes in. There are the radicals, and there's their victims, young people who believe in these things because they're brainwashed by that category. The rest of the people are there's the political people who driven to the organization because of politics, and there are profiteers, people who maybe believe or like the governance and and so on and so forth.
But those people, wouldn't they be turned off by the barbarism? I mean, going into the square and beheading people and putting their heads on stakes?
That does 2 things. It deters people from rebelling against the organization, so they ensure submission. people don't rebel against the organization. That's why we haven't seen examples of people from inside saying rebelling against the organization and saying, go away, leave our town. That has not happened. So it does that, and also it kind of inspires some of the young people, because people like violence. Some people, not like young people who think this violence is a result of something, and that gains traction in an atmosphere like Syria's and Iraq's atmospheres. Like war-torn countries.
So let's go back to the very beginning. This all started with Abu Mosab Al Zarqawi. He's a Jordanian, thuggish, really a criminal, and then he becomes religious. What happens then?
Well, the evolution of Abu Mosab Al Zarqawi was his ideology was born out in the prison system in Jordan, in the same way that many ISIS members were born out of the Iraqi prisons after the Iraq War. He was thuggish before he was imprisoned. He started flirting with kind of Islamist ideas at a young age when he started to go to mosques, and not that he did that in mosque, but like the group around him in the Zarqa. And Zarqa has refugee camps. It's not a normal city. But I think his transformation started in prison when he met Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. He's a very famous jihadi ideologue, partnered with him in prisons and became very close allies, and they started to plan and to join forces and kind of push towards promoting the ideology in Jordan. And then after that he moved to Afghanistan to fight in jihad,
And then he met bin Laden.
He did.
What happened when he met bin Laden?
There was tension between the two.
They didn't like each other?
They didn't like each other.
Why?
They had different views about what jihad stood for. I mean, they're not too dissimilar, but they have different approaches to how to conduct jihad. Osama bin Laden, for example, his mother she comes from an Alawite region in Syria, and Zarqawi believed that Shia, Alawites are part of Shia, at least in name. He believed that Shia are
apostates
enemies.
And should be killed.
And also they are eternal enemies of Sunnis. And he goes back to history and says the first Islamic State was brought down because of Shia, or what he thinks of Shia, and so on and so forth. And like the Ottomans. Also, he blames the fall of the Ottomans, or the kind of the Safavid in Iran, and their kind of conspiracy against the Ottomans. And he has a narrative that the Shia are our worst enemies, and the enemy within is the enemy that needs to be prioritized.
Which really explains his barbarism towards the Shia in Iraq and in Syria.
I think when he arrived in Iraq in 2000, he arrived before the war. He linked up with a Kurdish jihadi group. A lot of people don't understand this, that there was a jihadist group operating in Iraq before Saddam Hussein, like during the reign of Saddam Hussein, and it was operating in the north of Iraq. So he linked up with that organization, and that organization, astonishingly, had a lot of common practices like ISIS today in terms of enforcing Sharia, in terms of the brutality, and so on and so forth. So when he came to Iraq, that's when his ideology started to mature. He started to think, oh, Shia are really they're working with the Americans are working with the Shia, they're also working with Iran. There must be something going on. So his ideas, his hatred towards Shia, and his focus on Shia started to take root.
So here's the incredible part, is that Iran supported Zarqawi in those early years. Why did they do that?
Well, both the regime Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Iran kind of flirted with the insurgency of Iraq, because they thought the next countries that would be attacked would be Iran and Syria. And
for regime change by the United States.
Yeah. So they wanted to make sure that this occupation doesn't work, and that there's, the Americans will be dragged into a long war, and this is what happened. Like the Syrian regime, for example, and I remember this personally in 2004. Jihad is coming out of the Arab world and the Islamic world, into Syria, and from Damascus, they would travel from the Damascus airport the same way that Turkey does it today, or did it earlier in the Syrian conflict, and they would be transported from Damascus to Deir ez-Zor, to my hometown. My hometown was like at the exit from Syria into Iraq. And I remember in 2004, I was a student in Damascus, and when I was visiting my hometown, a taxi driver told me, you know, this has happened. Like, we transport jihadis
directly
all the
from the
time.
airport right into the border.
He was talking about from Abu Kamal to Iraq, to the other side of the border. And I didn't believe him. When I went back to my village, I basically said, this is what the taxi driver told me. And they said that there are actually a few people from my hometown went to Iraq to fight for Saddam Hussein.
Well, when did Iran realize that they had been helping this guy who was butchering Shia Muslims?
Well, it's a cynical game. A cynical game that some people believe still goes on, not in the sense that Iran still supports jihadists, but there is a sort of a deconfliction, if you like, between jihadists and Iran. They are fighting in Syria, supposedly by proxy, but there are rumors that there are still jihadists flowing from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, so on and so forth, to through Iran to Iraq or to Syria, through the Kurdish regions and so on. So there is that sense that that continues. They obviously today support the opposite side, the Assad regime, and also the Hashd al-Sha'b, or the popular mobilization forces or units in Iraq, which is a pro-government militia. And this organization has spearheaded the fight against ISIS in Iraq. And this is the trick, that both Iranian-backed militias and jihadists, Sunni jihadists in the region, benefit from each other. They actually, their existence, the existence of each one, helps the other to promote its own narrative and to make sure they get their rally people and mobilize people around them.
What do we know about the new leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi?
So he took over in 2010. That's when he became the leader of, at the time it was the Islamic State in Iraq. But
Zarqawi was killed in 2006.
That's right.
By an American airstrike.
Right, and he was followed by another person who is not a local, but he appointed Abu Mosab Al Baghdadi as the leader to Iraqize the organization. So Abu Bakr Baghdadi is different from previous ones because he's actually different from almost all jihadist ideologues and leaders, that he actually has training, religious training, or like academic training. He has a PhD in Islamic studies. He specialized in recitation of the Quran. And he graduated, I believe, in 2010. It's still murky that some people question even his PhD. But he claims also that he's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, or Prophet Muhammad family, through his grandson Al Hussein, who's revered by the Shia, which is ironic. But he believes that he's a descendant of the Prophet because, or he promotes that because that helps him in building legitimacy as a caliph or leader for Muslims.
He was actually in Camp Bucca, which it's an American prison in Iraq, for about a year in 2004.
That's correct.
What did he do there during that year in prison?
Well, we interviewed someone who oversaw the prison at the time, an American general, but he wasn't sure whether Baghdadi was the person he knew. But there are a few kind of anecdotes we can connect, that he was a religious leader in prison, that people resorted to him and kind of consulted him on various issues. And
you mean other people in prison, other prisoners?
Exactly, other kind of fellow prison inmates. And then he also linked up with former Ba'athists who repented, according to their kind of propaganda, and they became religious after the Iraq War. Some of them even resisted the Saddam Hussein regime in the 90s. One of the longest serving ISIS clerics, in fact, turned out to be that he was a jihadist since the 1980s, and a lot of people thought he was a Ba'athist, but he was a cleric. So he linked up with all these people, and he showed some signs of leadership, that he was actually a leader, and he was knowledgeable, but also he proved to be useful for other people who wanted to build a state, build some sort of an organization that represents Muslims, on the premise that this is a legitimate Islamic entity, that all Muslims, especially Sunnis, have to rally around it.
You talked about how Bashar al-Assad during the Iraq War would facilitate fighters coming right over the border into Iraq to destabilize Iraq. Why would he want to destabilize Iraq, and does he still want to destabilize Iraq?
I mean, it's the only smart thing to do as a dictator who's afraid, who's kind of is afraid that his turn would be next. It is to make sure that this project, this new project that was strange in the region, that regime change, claiming to be a democracy, and Bashar al-Assad wanted to portray this occupation as an occupation, obviously, and as a threat to everyone, and that this is not about democracy, it's not about promotion of democracy, it's about destabilizing Iraq and making sure that Iraq is not the regional power that used to be. So they found allies with a lot of people, a lot of people in the region, with different groups, and they wanted to destabilize Iraq because that's the only outcome that would ensure that Bashar al-Assad would survive in power.
Why, how, and when did ISIS enter Syria and set up their capital there?
So it was Ramadan 2011. That's when Abu Bakr Baghdadi dispatched a few of his lieutenants, people who, some of them were Syrians and some Iraqis, and I believe there were like a half a dozen, fighters. Some of them were leaders. I actually interviewed one of them, and he used to be a cleric with ISIS for many years, and he was also a person who dealt with tribes. He was in charge of tribal affairs in Iraq. So he went there and he was dispatched to a tribal area, which is Deir ez-Zor, my own hometown, and that's where he mainly operated. The rest were dispatched in the rest of Syria, and they started to revive some of the cells that Zarqawi established before inside Syria, and they started to operate and hit against the regime. In the beginning, their strategy centered around hitting the regime in as many areas as possible, so it seemed like they are a big organization. So they want to maximize their presence in Syria.
Why is Raqqa the capital? Why did they pick that as the capital?
They didn't pick it. I mean, Raqqa was, I can tell you, like, from a military perspective, like Raqqa was one of the provinces in eastern Syria that didn't rebel against the regime, that didn't have a local protest movement, or a very vibrant one, an organized one. So suddenly collapsed because some outsiders, rebel forces from Aleppo and from other areas, came to Raqqa and took Raqqa from the regime. So there's no local resistance. So there was a process of there was a turf war, competition, rivalry between different forces. And ISIS, when ISIS started to operate in that area, started to work with locals, started to buy the loyalty of some people who operated inside Raqqa. And when they announced the Caliphate, a lot of the people who were part of Jabhat al-Nusra,
which is an al-Qaeda organization.
Exactly.
They joined ISIS.
Jabhat al-Nusra, exactly.
You say in the book that ISIS has sleeper cells. What does that mean?
This is one of the major elements in the way ISIS operates in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, to make sure that not every member is known as an ISIS member, that there are sleeper cells operating in different areas. This was very central to how they took over areas. Their strategy is like this: that when they go to an area, they have already gathered so much information about the demographics, the people who live there, influential people, their potential enemies, and so on and so forth. So they knew in advance what goes on in that town. And they also had bought loyalty already there, so they had like sleeper cells, people who when ISIS advances in that area, they would just take over from inside. That was a pattern that existed for a while, and ISIS still has that in areas outside their control. They have people inside Baghdad, inside Damascus, inside the coastal region in Syria, and also in Turkey and elsewhere.
There was a divorce, so to speak, between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. What happened between the two?
The 2013 one was when Abu Bakr Baghdadi.
So there's more. You said there's the 2013 one.
There was differences. There were differences between them in during the Iraq War when Abu Mosab Al Zarqawi refused in the beginning, was like reluctant to pledge allegiance to Osama bin Laden. And in fact, he also had the same problem in Afghanistan when he had his own camp, but he wasn't really part of Al-Qaeda. He was sponsored by Al-Qaeda, but he wasn't by Osama bin Laden, but he didn't pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And then during the Iraq War, but the major one in 2013, that's when Abu Bakr Baghdadi from Iraq unilaterally announced a merger between Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and his group, Islamic State in Iraq. So it became Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And that's when Al-Qaeda Central refused that and said, no, each group operates in its territory, as in ISI will be in Iraq, and Jabhat al-Nusra will dominate in Syria. And Abu Bakr Baghdadi insisted, and that's when the major rupture happened.
And still to this day.
And still to this day. And this will define actually the next few years and probably decade. This rivalry is at the heart of ISIS operations outside Syria and Iraq. They want to establish themselves as the global leader of jihad. So if you notice, even their messaging is different. Their messaging in Libya, just outside Iraq and Syria and Turkey and elsewhere, when they carry out an attack, also in the West of course, they portray themselves as the true heirs of Osama bin Laden. Whereas inside Syria and Iraq, that messaging is not really so clear. They focus on sectarianism and other issues that are more locally, they're more local.
What comes next for ISIS? What's in their playbook? What's their next priority?
The next priority, I think, we have now a very dangerous phase where we see that ISIS is losing ground. It's lost 50% of its ground in Iraq and 20% of its territory in Syria. That's a total of like 40% of its territory lost over the past few years, or like 2 years. The problem today is that as they are losing territory, they're also increasing their suicide operations inside Iraq and Syria and outside. This is a trend that has been going on since November. If you notice, like at the time, November and before, they carried out 50 to 60 suicide operations a month. Today, they carry out 80 to 100 operations a month. That
in Iraq and Syria?
In Iraq and Syria alone. That shows you how many people they have who can still believe in this organization and believe they blow themselves up. They believe in the value of doing that. And this is the dangerous trend. There is a steady, controlled transition from territorial control to maximizing damage against their enemies. In 2014, they took the fight to their enemies in Baghdad, in the Kurdish regions and elsewhere. Now, because they're controlled militarily, or they're contained militarily because of the American intervention, they want to take the fight to their enemies through another means, which is suicide operations. They've done that in a way they didn't do in 2014. For example, recently from February till the end of Ramadan, or the end of last month, was like operation. They carried out operations in the heartlands of the Alawite areas in Syria. They attacked inside the Sadr city in Baghdad. These are supposedly well protected areas, and ISIS could infiltrate these areas.
Hassan, you end the book with these words, quote, "The army of terror will be with us indefinitely." Surely that doesn't mean that they're undefeatable.
No, they are stoppable. In 2014, we thought it was unstoppable because the Americans were not there. The Americans came and changed the equation. They will remain with us in terms of ideology. They will remain with us as an insurgency in Iraq and Syria. They will remain as a menace for at least a decade. They're not going to go away. And I say that not because they are somehow undefeatable, but also because their opponents are not capable of doing the right thing to defeat them, which is the political solution in Syria and Iraq that appeals to everyone, and that everyone sees value in becoming part of this government and seeing the government as serving their own interests rather than a sectarian government beholden to Iran.
Hassan, I want to thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.